Welcome, Joseph Skaria, for agreeing to talk to me for the IAS newsletter. I am Professor Nayanika Mookherjee from anthropology, and I'm one of the co-directors of the IAS. And here to talk with us is Joe Skaria, who was a late law, who was on a late law scholarship in his first year with the project An Abolitionist Industrial Complex: Patterns of Anti-Trafficking, Anti-Slavery Policy and Practice in the 21st Century. The principal investigators for which was Dr. Siobhan McGrath and Dr. Alison Jove. And Joe, we are really interested in knowing about your own research as a late law scholar with this project, because you were researching NGOs that tackle modern slavery, and you have explored how they wield influence, what influence they have, and the kind of decisions they make itself. So it's really exciting because it engages in really interesting ways to work I do on sexual violence and conflict, and the kind of NGO work within that, the funding that goes into it, the whole kind of understanding of the NGO world around these kind of very topical themes, and also some work I've done and taught on the illegal migration industry. There's a book called Illegality Inc. by an anthropologist as well. So it kind of links up really well theoretically to lots of interesting things. But it would be great to start to ask you how this project originated for you. How did you get interested in it? And in some ways, how was it linked to Dr. McGrath and Dr. Jobe's wider project on the abolitionist industrial complex?
Yeah, so Dr. McGrath's research I became familiar with after I applied to be, I looked into being a late law scholar. So the way it works with late law scholarship is that you can either suggest your own research question, or there's professors will suggest topics that they're interested in, and you can pick a topic and say, I'd like to research this, this looks interesting. So that was me. I hadn't actually heard that much about anti-slavery. When I chose to research it, I thought it sounded interesting, and I've always had an interest in how policy can affect human rights. So it seemed right up my street, but really I was going in completely blind. And one of the things I found most interesting when I started the project was this awareness of how deeply the policy-making process itself impacts people, right? Because we often think about policy as the thing which impacts people, which is, true. But the very nature of who makes decisions, how do we make decisions about things, that in itself can be really, really powerful, and it's often under-examined. So Dr. McGrath's work, I worked with Dr. McGrath, seemed to be looking a lot into the anti-slavery field, kind of tendencies in the field towards certain narratives. I was brought in as a late law scholar, and we talked about researching basically where the money is going, right, in this field. Dr. McGrath got me access to the foundation directory online, which is this directory of not all the foundations, but a lot of the foundations, particularly American ones, and what charities they're funding. So I basically was able to refine this database to find the top 20 foundations that are giving money towards freedom from slavery causes. So freedom from slavery was the name of the refinement. So that was the group you could refine with in the database. And then of these 20 foundations, I looked at which 10 organizations for each foundation were receiving the most anti-slavery money, right? So that meant that there weren't actually 200 organizations to analyze, because some foundations funded fewer than 10 anti-slavery organizations. But nonetheless, there were more than 100 organizations, which I went through analyzing their policies. And then the idea was that by kind of systematically doing that, I could then extrapolate and say, okay, so this foundation tends to fund these kinds of charities, or this foundation tends to fund these kinds of charities, which was really interesting. And even though the work itself was a bit tedious, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of trawling through web pages, it was very enjoyable, and it was very satisfying to have done. So I think that answers your question, hopefully.
Yeah. No, fantastic. That's a great start. And was there a specific reason why you were focusing primarily only on America, apart from the very kind of scale of it, obviously. But is there a difference between the focus, if it was, say, on UK versus America? Is there a distinction about that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I slightly misspoke. The foundation directory line isn't exclusively American. It just so happens that a lot of the foundations it maps were American. I actually can't answer. I don't know whether most of the foundations funding anti-slavery were American, because in reality it does tend to be that it's American foundations who are, having the biggest impact on the field, or if there are gaps in the FDO that I am not aware of. So foundations which haven't chosen to put that information onto the directory. So I can't definitively say which it is, but obviously American foundations have had a huge impact on the anti-slavery field. And this is well documented in the literature. So it seems to be that foundations that I was mapping, in terms of where the money is coming from, literature seems to say that a lot of the money is coming from America. So I use the foundation directory online because even if it doesn't necessarily map every, grant that's given ever, it seemed pretty representative and, fairly exhaustive.
Yeah. So what kind of methods did you use which allowed you to kind of do this? Because there's a time span for the state law scholarship, right, to do this work?
Yeah. So I went over the time span. I got too into the research.
Great.
It was like so in terms of extracting the data from the database, that wasn't too difficult. It was just refining the database using the fields I was able to manipulate on the website, and then extracting that data, putting it into Excel. So that wasn't too hard. The hard part was going through every organization and analyzing its policies. Before I end up publishing what I found, me and Siobhan have talked about tightening some of my definitions and making sure that everything's airtight, because obviously though it's, I did so much that it's easy to make mistakes, and in some of my methodology I think I could have been a bit more precise. So before I publish it, I'm hoping to tighten up some of the definitions. But it was basically I read a lot of literature about anti-slavery first, to see what kind of tendencies scholars were pointing out. So for instance, one of the articles I read spoke about an increasing proliferation of digitized tools to try and fight anti-slavery. So for instance, tools online where you can report slavery where you see it, or tools where you can report if you see something online which you think is evidence of slavery, you can report it there. So I thought, that's an interesting trend. I'm going to systematically look for that. So because I saw that in the literature, then for every organization that I went through their website, I went through their homepage, their about page, various documents, and tried to find if they used digitized tools. And that was one out of the many fields that I looked for. So I looked for if the organization was religious, if the organization was taking an approach which was more punitive, or more preventative, or more kind of rehabilitative. Again, I've defined it a bit more precisely in the paper itself, and I hope to tighten those up. So I don't want to make sweeping statements, because you have to be very nuanced with this stuff. But it was difficult. I think a lot of the time, finding this information was tricky, because websites don't always make it clear what their policies are, or whether they're religious, whether they support the rights of sex workers, etc. And often these positions aren't ones which can be neatly categorized. So that was kind of a challenge I found, where even when I was mapping whether organizations were religious, which you think would be pretty clear cut, there were a couple of organizations I found which had been founded by religious founders, and it's like, oh well, do I categorize that as religious, or do I not do so unless they're explicitly religious? And there were some which used to be religious and then kind of, without making a big deal of it, took away the religious element. And it's like, well, is that still something that I should mention, or how do you even mention that on a spreadsheet where it's yes or no? So it did make me think. Even the nature of doing this research kind of revealed to me how heterogeneous a lot of the field is, which was a very interesting outcome. But obviously, for the nature of the work I was doing, which was trying to see if there were systemic trends in what the thing was, I had to make judgment calls and try and sacrifice absolute precision for hoping to find some trends in where the funding was going. So yeah, it was a very interesting project to do in that sense, because I think I learned a lot about not only my precise findings, but also about like how difficult it is to conduct research in the anti-slavery field as a whole.
Yeah, it is. And I remembered, I noted one thing you said in your document that there are no organizations who which is something you mentioned right now. There are no organizations which really support the rights of sex workers, right? Most of them have to be anti-trafficking to get the funding in this instance. And so, as you know, within feminists itself, there's a whole kind of big division between the terminology of and the baggage that what does prostitution mean and what does sex work mean. And there's big kind of, and how did you grapple with that divide? Because clearly when we talk about anti-trafficking, it follows possibly in referring to the use of the word prostitution rather than sex work, right?
Yeah.
So how did you grapple with those kind of semantic minefield? Really?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And again, it's tricky because again, a lot of these organizations aren't very clear on their position. And to be fair, in my paper, I think one of the things Siobhan commented when she saw my draft. So basically, the way that Laidlaw works is you publish something on the Laidlaw website, which is what can be found online if you look up my name. And you need to publish that in order to fulfill the requirements of the scholarship. So I did that, but there's still lots of things which could be improved. So I really want to stress that, like it's not like the finished outcome. But yeah, so basically it's quite tricky to look into it because most anti-trafficking organizations are kind of anti-sex work, right? Or they seem to take a position on sex work, which is that we should try and reduce it, or even if they don't necessarily actively advocate against sex work, they often moralize against it, or they might, use the imagery of sex work in their advertisements or their, promotional materials. And it was really tricky to grapple with that complexity because, again, like I said just before, like, I was having to make judgment calls as to like, oh, well, is this a pro-sex work organization? Is this anti-sex work? A lot of them I just left blank because I couldn't clearly define it. I think in the end, what I did, and again, it's debatable whether this was a good definition to use. I found it to be useful when I was doing my systematic research. But I basically treated organizations which explicitly treated sex work and trafficking as distinct as pro, and organizations which said they were intrinsically entangled as anti. And I'd probably change that wording now. So I'd probably say, even a lot of the organizations which treat them as distinct may not be pro-sex work. So I think that was, maybe the wrong wording to use. But nonetheless, it was interesting because, even just by, going off that definition, which, might include a lot of organizations which are anti-sex work in the pro-sex work definitions, even by that kind of faulty definition of what is pro-sex work, most of the foundations I looked at funded more anti-sex work organizations than pro-sex work organizations. And again, it's not overly surprising given the literature, because qualitative papers seem to highlight that much of the anti-TFLS discourse deals in these tropes of the sex worker who lacks any agency and has been forced into this line of work. So, it wasn't surprising to me necessarily, but yeah, sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It's quite a minefield, and it's worth thinking about. What language is also used is also kind of, I found this quite debates. I've been engaged with this debate for ages, and so I know that the changes in language and policies, what is used, say, in Sweden versus what is, say, used in Netherlands or Scotland versus, there's different sets of languages used in terms of figure out the position on trafficking and trafficking itself. So if you had to say what were the conclusions or findings for your project, what would you say they were?
Right. So basically, so in terms of the analysis of the field as a whole, then there were some interesting kind of more peculiar things which I think require a lot of people to look into them more, because I found it interesting. So actually the biggest anti-TFLS grant maker in the database was the United States Federal Highway Association, Highway Administration, which is very odd to me. I thought,
Yeah.
and actually it dwarfed the other grant makers. So I'll see if I can find a precise figure. But, for a moment, I wondered if maybe the database has got confused with anti-trafficking and anti-traffic. I was like, how can possibly the Federal Highway Administration give this much money to? But no, the database category, as I said, was freedom from slavery, which is quite a clear category, I think. So that the United States Federal Highway Administration gave out 246,420,000, and then the next biggest foundation grant maker, I should say, because they're not all foundations, was only 88 million, right? So it's an insane level of, it's almost a degrees of scale, not difference, right? That was interesting, stuff like that. Again, I can't really say much more about that because I haven't looked into, every grant maker that they've done, but that foundation was mostly funding transport departments, and it's kind of, I think that's something to look into because it doesn't seem clear where that money is going. Most of the foundations funding them were from the US, and unsurprisingly, most of the foundations were funding NGOs as opposed to businesses and this. Sorry, I'm trying to find something which is some of the most interesting findings.
I saw the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also had quite a substantial contribution to some of the ones I saw. Yeah. I mean, there's loads of them. You've got amazing reams of tables of these different categories of organizations.
That is true. So in terms of which types of organizations get the most funding, and it seems that most of the grant makers, half of the grant makers favor a kind of punitive approach. So in my paper, I've come up with this other definition, like the short-term ex-post approach, which is basically like services that aim to help traffic victims after the crime has happened, but only in the short term. So that's punishment, imprisonment, rescuing slaves, but it might not necessarily involve actually helping former traffic victims rehabilitate their lives, and it also doesn't deal with the structural factors. And then so that was half of the grant makers preferred those. 5 of them gave the most favored a long-term ex-post approach, which is like rehabilitation, helping victims after the crime has taken place. I suppose even calling it a crime is playing into some kind of narrative. It's very tricky. Anyway, helping people after the instance of trafficking has taken place in the long term. So that's like, reintegration in society and stuff like that. One favored like a systemic approach and a long-term ex-post approach equally, and 4 of them favored a systemic approach, which is like the structural causes of TFLS. So you can see there is a kind of a tendency towards the more short-termist policymaking.
Punitive more, yeah.
Yeah, which again isn't surprising, but it was a very interesting finding, because obviously like it was I've systematically shown that like a lot of them are funding that kind of stuff. Again, there's a couple of tendencies. So slightly more grant makers prefer international organizations. There's the kind of anti-sex work bias, it seems. The majority of grant makers fund at least one organization that focuses on exclusively women or children. For 3 of the grant makers, organizations focusing on women and children make up half of their top grantees, i.e. half of the organizations which are getting their most anti-slavery money. 11 of the grant makers funded among those top 10 that I analyzed, at least one organization that uses or sells digitized anti-slavery tools. And 12 of them have funded, among their top 10 grantees, at least one explicitly religious organization. So again, 12 out of 20, slight majority. So yeah, they're very broad findings. I think in terms of the kind of usefulness of my research, I think a lot of it is more kind of pointers as opposed to like an in-depth analysis of like one particular, area, which is both its strength and its weakness. Like I think it would have been nice to go more deeply into, just whether or not they're funding religious organizations or just whether they're funding, mostly anti-sex work organizations. But I think it has been interesting to get this overview of the whole field and all these, variety of tendencies, because I think, it does illuminate areas which require a lot more research, I think. So.
Did you find out why the highway agencies were the biggest funders? That's kind of intriguing finding.
I looked into, so basically for their top 10 grantees, I'll see if I can find that. Sorry, 1 second. So basically most of the grantees were transportation departments in states. So for instance, the biggest recipient of anti-slavery funds from the United States Federal Highway Association was the California Department of Transportation. And basically the only evidence I could find online of these transportation departments having anti-slavery policies was this pledge that a lot of them had signed, which was the Transportation Leaders Against Human Trafficking. I'm not sure I've quite got that right. I don't have it in front of me, but I think as far as I can remember, that's basically what it's called. Essentially, it was this vow to enact policies to like look for trafficking, like on the railways. So it was saying like more surveillance, essentially, sometimes awareness initiatives to like make people aware of the signs of trafficking. But it's interesting because so much money was going towards this particular pledge, it seems, because out of the top 10 organizations, governmental departments being funded by the United States Federal Highway Administration, I think 9 of them I could confirm that they were part of this pledge, and it's the only real anti-TFLS policy I could find online about any of these organizations. So I assume that must be what the money is going towards. But it's baffling to me how this much money could be spent on anything like this. It's potentially, the workers of these transportation departments are getting training. Potentially it's towards surveillance. It does seem to take, from what I read, more of an approach where it treats it as like, a crime to be spotted, right? So it's not something we can prevent. It's something we can, tackle when we see a manifestation of it, but it's almost like an aberration against the order of things as opposed to a result of the order of things, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's quite interesting that the highway agencies involved in this way is it's really interesting, actually. And how has, in a way, the findings of this project, how has it fed into the IAS project, the abolitionist industrial complex? How have these findings made their way into it?
Yeah, so we haven't got that far yet, really, into the stage. Like I said, I went over the time frame of the research project because there was a lot to do. So I can't say definitively how that will factor into Siobhan's research, but I will say that it was. I think it was really interesting for both of us because I fed a lot on her research in terms of making sense of what these findings might mean for policy. So she's written a paper on marketizing anti-slavery, which I'm not sure she's published yet, but she let me read that. And the kind of general thesis of this paper, which I'll sum up very crudely, was that a lot of anti-slavery organizations craft their strategies in order to attract funding. Well, they have to. There's an incentive to do so, because the way that NGO funding systems work is such that they have to play to northern donors as opposed to, you know, the people that they're necessarily helping.
Sure.
So in that respect, I think my work fits into that framework that she's, you know, been, you know, articulating, because while I haven't within the scope of my research been able to say why these foundations are funding these types of charities, it does seem to be a very cogent explanation to say that a lot of NGOs are, you know, it's kind of a two-way thing. So on one hand, NGOs craft their policies such that they'll receive funding from these big foundations, which might, incentivize them to become more sensationalist, or to maybe create more dramatic narratives out of the things they're tackling. And on the other hand, the foundations themselves often want, you know, quick results, measurable results. So there was a paper by, let's see if I can find the name. One sec. Yes, Jay Chuang, Giving as Governance, Philanthrocapitalism and Modern Day Slavery Abolitionism. And he was talking about how this rise in philanthropic organizations run by businessmen has created this incentive for NGOs to be run like businesses, right? So a focus on, you know, can you show this reduction in, you know, this time frame, and can we eradicate slavery as though it was some kind of business problem we have to, you know, figure out the optimal input and the optimal output. You know, has led to this seeming preference for I don't want to be too sensationalist when I'm talking about sensationalism, because that would be ironic, but it does seem to have led to this.
I mean, it fits in this work, and fits into a wider set of, as I was saying at the beginning, wider set of issues around other themes, which is similarly kind of structured around. And there's kind of similar sort of problems around sexual violence and conflict, around illegality of migrants, and you know, kind of migrant asylum claim issues itself as well. So I think there's a kind of wider set of issues within which this research is based on. It's actually very topical, thinking about many of the kind of migration concerns that UK is having right now, and the asylum claims around which these kind of issues are also emerging, and whether trafficking narratives enable a quicker asylum as well. But one, in a way, you've already touched on the role of religion, and I don't know whether you want to say anything more on the role of religion in your project, and also the kind of the role of demography of that, of the role of gender dynamics within the project, and your findings, if you wanted to say anything.
Yes. I think so. The reason I looked into religion was because there was another article I read. It was Beyond Strange Bedfellows by M.G. Grant, and it spoke about how the idea of you know, this massive boom in anti-trafficking work was partially the result of this kind of alliance between anti-sex work feminists and the conservative right, often the conservative religious right, sorry, I should say, in a bit of this answer. And I found that really interesting, because it did seem that this alliance politically had a very outsized impact on the direction of the anti-trafficking field, right? You know, even in that kind of alliances, sorry, I'm speaking of an alliance if it's a very clear thing. It's often muddier than that, but it did seem to be that lobbying by the religious groups at the time, that anti-trafficking was, you know, being articulated as a distinct field, lobbied such that the kind of anti-sex work nature of anti-trafficking was ingrained into it from the start. So because of that kind of, because of the fact that the religious right in America had such an outsized impact on the anti-trafficking field, I wanted to see whether that was still the case in which organizations were getting funding. So that was my impetus to look into whether organizations were religious or not. And in terms of demography, yeah, likewise, there were articles I read which were talking about how, in terms of the narratives we use about who has agency and who doesn't have agency, it seems to be that people generally find it much easier to ascribe agency to men, adult men, and to assume that women and children lack it totally. Yeah, I thought that was really, really interesting, because it's not something which, you know, when I read this article, before I'd read it, I didn't think that the question of gender had too much to do with the definitions we use of anti-slavery, right? I was like, well, surely, you know, if someone's forced to do work, they're forced to do work. That doesn't really depend on gender. But as soon as I, you know, read that article, I realized that, you know, even the idea of, you know, being forced to do something is so much more gray and slippery than often people would like to admit. And
gendered.
Yes, exactly, gendered and aged. And where we draw that line, even if we think it's a very clear boundary and that we're, you know, very rationally drawing the boundary here and not here, often where we draw that boundary is quite arbitrary. And I think something that plays into who gets the most funding, right? So it did seem to be that, for instance, organizations which focus on women and girls, and sometimes children in general, were very, very popular, which is obviously, you know, great in itself, but it did make me think about whether there are demographic gaps in who's being funded, right? So certain organizations have explicitly said this. So I think ECPAT has a global boys initiative, if I can remember rightly,
right.
With the idea being that, you know, boys who are trafficked don't get enough attention. And again, I can't definitively say whether or not that's true in general, but at least from the scope of my research, that does seem to be the tendency. And yeah, I don't know, it was quite interesting to see it laid out so starkly, right? To see there were no organizations at all which focused exclusively on adult men or on, right? And I think that in itself does tell you a bit about who gets funding and who doesn't, or even, you know, what we even consider worth making an organization about, right?
Right. Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry. So just to link the two answers, like in terms of which religious organizations get funding and which demographic groups get more funding, I think both of them do play into the narratives surrounding anti-trafficking, which is why it's important to understand them.
Yeah. And it also obviously plays into the very kind of idea of victimhood, right? Who is the victim in the anti-trafficking story itself? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and I think one of the things I took away from this research was a real interest in how we could change this, right? Not just in the anti-trafficking field, but I figured, you know, in NGOs as a whole, often we do rely on these narratives of victimhood and, you know, we have agencies, we will help these people without agency, right? That's not exclusive to anti-trafficking. As my second summer in Laidlaw, I basically wanted to interview other non-profit leaders about these problems in their own fields. And it was really interesting because, yeah, some really great work is being done in all sorts of NGOs in all sorts of fields. But all three of them had a lot to say about the problems of sensationalism and, you know, the tendency with a lot of NGOs to sensationalize as a means of survival, right? So I interviewed Tim Livesey, who's the head of this organization called Embrace the Middle East. Again, they don't work specifically on trafficking, they work on issues in the Middle East in general. But he was talking about the future of non-profit work in Britain specifically. And he was saying that he thinks that as, you know, people, as the decades roll by, like it may be that charities have to compete more and more for funding. And he worries that the temptation to sensationalize will actually increase, like it's not getting any better. And, you know, even, yeah, all three of them, you know, related to the findings of my research in some way. That's just one example. And I don't want to talk about that for too long because I'm aware this interview is about anti-slavery, but it was really interesting to know that it's not specific to anti-slavery, although it may be particularly apparent in it.
No, absolutely. It links up in various fields as well. I think people who would be seeing this interview, we've been talking about your document that is there on the Laidlaw Scholarship website. But can you say a little bit more? So it's not yet published, right? So you're planning publications around it, possibly, yes. Or whether this document has been disseminated, if you have had any response to this document that you have on the Laidlaw Scholarship website.
Yeah, so I'm hoping to properly disseminate it very soon. So it is available publicly if anyone would like to read it. I think ironically, not ironically, sorry, I don't know why I said that. I misused the word, but having done this research, I am aware more than ever of the importance of being careful with how we communicate, right? So I think it's kind of interesting, like having done it, I'm almost quite reticent to publish it without thoroughly checking everything, because
sure.
So much of the reading I did was about how misinformation is damaging. So I'd hate to, hastily publish something which is full of, if there is, I'd like to think there isn't much, too many errors with the report, but I am taking my time with making it, as comprehensive and sensitive as I can before I publish it, because I, would rather say something useful in 5 years as opposed to saying something subpar now. So.
And would you publish it as a journal article or as a kind of a more public facing portal online, or in a kind of what are the kind of ideal spaces do you feel is appropriate for that document?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think research in general, maybe not all research should be intended to be read by the public, but I do believe very strongly in the fact that I personally believe that research findings should be communicated to the public in a way that they can understand.
Mm-hmm.
So I am very, very certain that whatever direction this paper takes, one of the big things I want to pursue is communicating the general findings of this research and also the implications of this research for how we can maybe run NGOs better in general. For instance, I gave a talk at my university's Amnesty International Society about the general findings of my research and sensationalism in general, and it was very, very gratifying because everyone who heard the talk told me that they hadn't really thought about the issues before, that it made them think differently. And I think a lot of why I do things in general is to kind of have some kind of concrete impact. And I think one of the ways that research can do that is by communicating their findings in a more intentional way, because I think a lot of the time research is published which can be quite esoteric to the public. That's one of the things I want to brush up before I do publish it, because
sure.
I think the work that I've done is quite esoteric and I'd like to communicate it more simply. I think in terms of where I publish it, me and Siobhan have talked about looking at the anti-trafficking review, things like that, because we think people there would find it useful. Again, I don't want to be arrogant enough to think it's definitely going to be published or whatever. Like, I'm not going to make any claims about the quality of my research, but yeah, it would be great to have it published eventually.
Sure. And do you have any kind of final reflections on doing this project as a Laidlaw scholar as part of the IAS project on the abolitionist industrial complex? So you did it in your first year, now you're in your third year.
Yeah.
How has it kind of changed your academic thinking trajectory, or does it have any impact on the future of your thinking itself as a result of this project?
Yeah, definitely. I think I said before briefly that the project itself has given me a much more it's difficult to define it. It almost sounds a bit too profound an impact for a research project to have, but I think it did make me much more thoughtful about how I want to pursue change making in the world, right? So a lot of these organizations aren't necessarily badly intentioned, right? So obviously, a lot of the literature critiques anti-slavery organizations for, you know, playing into narratives which are untrue or not being very effective, despite the fact that they claim to be effective. And I think those are very valid critiques, but it's important to remember that a lot of these NGOs are very well intentioned. It's just that they're not very informed, right? So I think one of the biggest takeaways I took from this was that a kind of sense of humility, right? It was like, if a lot of these organizations just had more humility about how they go about changing the world, if they maybe stopped to, you know, read around the topic before jumping into policy, then maybe we'd not be having this conversation, right? And I think that kind of humility isn't something which is advocated explicitly in our society a lot of the time, right? So a lot of people talk about acting now, or you have to act this way. We're constantly bombarded with people trying to convince us of things. And I think even the act of researching something immersively for that long a period of time and getting to grips with the nuances of it, that was something I'd never done to that scale before. And I think I went into it, you know, very kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I'm still, you know, very optimistic about our generation, or my generation, sorry, and how, you know, it is possible to do good. I don't take a nihilistic approach at all, but I think it did give me a humility that I didn't have before. So that was a very long
I think it's great to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed throughout our life and to be curious, and I think it's a great perspective to have, and I want to thank you a lot for this exchange. I have learned also a lot from it, and I look forward to hearing more about what you do with this work in the future itself. So I'm going to stop this recording now. And thanks a lot, Joe Skaria.
Thank you very much.